Happy New Year! We thought it would be great to bring in 2026 with just talking about evolution, having a little New Year's evolution bash. So I'm here with Dr. Cornelius Hunter, a biophysicist who's done a lot of work studying studying biology and also the history and philosophy involved in the theory of evolution. So we're going to talk about just a few of the problems that we see in evolution. So welcome, Dr. Hunter. Thanks for being
Happy New Year, Rebekah. Thank you very much for having me. And it is January 1st, New Year. What is on everyone's mind today? Well, I think it's antifreeze. It's freezing out. And so people are worried about that. Let's talk about antifreeze and specifically antifreeze proteins. Nature has a different solution than what we use. You know, when we put antifreeze into our cars' radiators, it changes the freezing point. It lowers the freezing point so your liquid doesn't freeze. Nature has proteins that will bind to ice crystals and stop the ice from forming. It's a whole different solution, whole different method that is very fancy and complicated. But I want to talk about that. But first, in order for that to make sense and for people to understand it, I need to provide a little context. And I need to explain something called normal science. Normal science is a concept that's pretty important to have in mind as you read the literature. And yet, a lot of people don't know what it is, have never heard of it, and have no concept of normal science. Once you understand normal science, things like antifreeze proteins and how those evolved, how evolutionists talk about that, are going to make a lot more sense. So let me take a minute and talk about normal science. If you can bring up the slides, I will start using those. I'm going to use an example to illustrate what is normal science. And that what I'm going to talk about is eukaryotes, the eukaryotic cell. What is that? So about 75 years ago, let's say mid 20th century, people thought there were two kinds of cells. There was the prokaryotes and there was the eukaryotes. That's what you may have learned in your 10th grade biology class, right?
Yep.
So the eukaryote, this is not to scale. So the eukaryotes are a lot bigger. They're also a lot more complicated. They have a nucleus. The prokaryotes don't have that. They have organelles. They have DNA packed into the nucleus, an incredibly complicated packing technology. And, all these organelles like mitochondria. So a lot bigger, a lot more complicated. Prokaryotes are your basic like bacteria and things like that. So you got a simple version, prokaryotes, a complicated version, eukaryotes. How do you think evolutionists thought about this? Get the prokaryote cells are smaller and simpler than eukaryote cells. What did evolution predict about their origins? I'll bet you people in the audience can guess this one pretty well. What did evolutionists say back in 1950, 1960? What did they say? Well, yeah, they said that the eukaryotes evolved from the prokaryotes. That's obvious common descent logic. The complicated, the bigger, the more sophisticated came later after the prokaryotes. Well, evolution predicted the eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes, but even at this cartoon level, this high-level scenario version of evolution where you don't have any details of actually what happened, it didn't work. So many problems arose with the common descent model, the everything from the proteins and on up. Evolutionists had difficulty drawing that tree, that evolutionary tree. Also, in the 1970s, 80s timeframe, there was another type of cell was discovered. Carl Woese at the University of Illinois started suggesting, I think there's another kind of cell. It's not just prokaryotes and eukaryotes. There's also something he called the archaea. And it's another kind of cell. I won't go into all the details of why this is distinct, but okay, there's 3 kinds of cells now. So that's another problem of, okay, it's not just, eukaryotes evolving from prokaryotes. You've got a threesome going on. How did that work? So the problem of how eukaryotes evolved became a thing, right? It wasn't easy to figure that out. And there's a whole bunch of cartoon level scenarios floated by evolutions on how to describe that, and none of them worked. That's why there was a whole bunch of them, right? And so the evolution of eukaryotes got its own name, and that's really kind of the killer problem here, is because the eukaryotes are so much more complicated that, of course, even how prokaryotes could have evolved is itself a thing that is also not explained by evolution in any sort of detail, any sort of scientific detail. It's all just high-level cartoons, and so that actually is itself a contradiction to evolutionary theory. But what's kind of gotten the attention here is, gee, how did eukaryotes come about in this game? Evolution has this incredibly long sequence of major steps being taken. There's the origin of life. There's the prokaryotes. There's the eukaryotes. There's multicellularity. There's fish. There's amphibians. There's reptiles. There's birds, mammals. So each level is unexplained by evolution. They don't have the goods on any of these. So eukaryogenesis is not like this one thing that stands out as, oh, gee, this is a problem, but otherwise evolution pretty much has it figured out. This is one in many, but it is a really significant problem for evolutionary theory, eukaryogenesis. So sometimes evolutionists like to go to Google. So to Google we go here, and it says eukaryogenesis is the pivotal evolutionary process where simple prokaryotic cells transformed into complex eukaryotic cells. Now, skipping down, the exact sequence and mechanisms are still debated, with some theories even involving viral participation. So all kinds of cartoon level ideas on how this could have evolved, how this could have happened, because none of them work. So even AI is explaining this. Now, here is a review paper, a more detailed review paper from 2024 on this problem. And it starts out, the origin of the eukaryotic cell, with its compartmentalized nature and generally large size compared with bacterial and archaeal cells, represents a cornerstone event in the evolution of complex life on Earth. So yeah, it's this major step, right? So skipping down, it says the branch separating the first from the last common ancestor of all eukaryotes is long and what? Lacks evolutionary intermediates. I should have called that yellow, not red. It's a little hard to see, but it lacks evolutionary intermediates. Okay, that's a problem for evolutionary theory. You have to have these intermediates. It has to be a gradual process with all these little tiny incremental steps, one over the next, and each one is really easy to achieve, and each one provides an enhanced fitness. So you get to your next level. So the road from prokaryotes and archaea to eukaryotes has to be laid out, a brick road with each little step at a time, right? But that's not what's happened. So as a result, the timing and driving forces of the emergence of complex eukaryotic features remain poorly understood. So this is not a done deal at all. You can't say, evolution is a fact. You can't say evolution is even a good theory. You have these major problems that after many, many years, by the way, this isn't like they started looking at it yesterday. This is decades, better part of a century looking at this problem. And it still remains unsolved.
Okay, well, let me interject, because I've come to you with this before, but for those who may be watching you for the first time, let me interject with what they will say, which is, well, we don't know everything. We don't have it all figured out, but we have so much evidence for evolution that even, we'll figure that out later. It's not a problem.
Yeah, so we need to take each evidence one at a time, because when they say we have so much evidence, there's this mountain of evidence. Well, actually, there isn't. And so when you actually ask the question, well, what is that mountain of evidence? So you get, you can Google that, you can get a mountain of evidence, and each one is like this. It's problematic. That's why I went through that sequence, the origin of life on up to mammals. Each one is problematic. It's not just the eukaryotes. So the retort that, we don't know everything. Come on, give me a break. No, we don't know anything is the better way of putting it. It fails over and over and over again. So that's the problem. It's a consistent pattern. All of the major fundamental predictions of evolutionary theory have failed. And so that's not a good track record. So no, you don't have a good track record. And that's the problem here. So it is a problem. Eukaryogenesis is one example, but this is a problem. And there are really, we can think of two separate problems here, or two separate categories of problems. One, there's no compelling cartoon level scenario that works. That's why there's so many. And two, there's no details. There's no detail for any given scenario. What is the actual sequence of mutations that occurred? This is huge gaps. So even if you were to take one of the cartoon level scenarios and say, okay, maybe this one will work, how did that actually happen in detail? Give me some science behind that. We don't have that. So two major problems here. So that's the context. I want to show you now a typical run-of-the-mill journal paper on eukaryogenesis. This is from 2023. I want to show you some, I'm not going to go through the details of what they're talking about here. This is more of a how to read a paper, how to read an evolution paper. So it starts out with a non-controversial statement. In the ongoing debates about eukaryogenesis, you got these debates, it's not working. The Asgard archaea have been found to play a key part. Okay, that's a major group of archaea. So I won't go into the Asgard is just a major group within the archaea. And so evolutionists think, this is the one that looks like it's most related to the eukaryotes. It has the best promise, or these are the ones that gave birth to the eukaryotes somehow. It's not quite working, but they're kind of focusing on that group. Okay, so the Asgard archaea play a key part as the closest archaeal relatives of eukaryotes. Okay, that's the background. Now they're going to do some research. They're going to do something here. We find that eukaryotes are placed with high confidence as a well-nested clade within archaea, the Asgard archaea. Okay, with high confidence. I want to focus on that, with high confidence. Now, wait a minute. Where did that come from? How do we have high confidence? We just talked about how this theory isn't working, and how eukaryogenesis in particular is a good example of that, and how it's a major problem. Not only do you not have a high-level cartoon-level description, or scenario, you don't have scientific details to back it up. In fact, they admit there's these huge gaps. There's no intermediate. There's a long stretches lacking intermediate. So how could we have high confidence of this? So wait a minute. We just talked about how the science contradicts the theory. We have these two problems. So what's going on? How can we understand this? Are they just lying? What's going on? So in order to understand this, they're not just lying. We need to revisit 1962 and Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He's a philosopher of science, and this is a good book, Thomas Kuhn. And he described the history of science as typically, not always, but typically working in paradigms. So science works in paradigms. You have groups or communities of scientists working in paradigms. They develop a language, a lingo, terminology that they can use. They develop literature that they share. They have shared assumptions. They're working in a paradigm. This works this way. This is the way. These are the underlying assumptions we're working with. Obviously, with evolution, there's a paradigm. There's a paradigm that life evolved naturally somehow. That's the paradigm. So he described this cycle, and he has many, many examples of this in the history of science, where you have let's start here with a paradigm change. So you have a new paradigm arising. Let's say Darwin creates this new paradigm. And following that, you have what he called normal science. Now, what that means is people working within the paradigm with their shared lingo, shared terminology and assumptions and so forth. And they're moving along within the paradigm. So that picture them in a box and learning how this works, assuming it's true, not even questioning, never questioning the paradigm. The paradigm is not up for debate. That's a given. That's how the funding grants are developed and so forth. The people reviewing the funding grants and the people writing the funding grants share the same assumptions. You're not getting funded on the basis of whether or not the paradigm is true. You're getting funded on the basis of how well you're working within the paradigm and what your cool new ideas are within the paradigm. Now, as time goes by, you have problems developing, and the paradigm starts to break down. He calls that model drift. As oh well, we got this problem, got that problem. They tend to get swept under the rug. It's like they're put into a parking lot. They are this is another idea we need to look at later. It's food for thought, grounds for further research. Yeah, we don't know everything. Come on, but this is true. So we have this model drift. It continues until you get into a crisis. The model is actually failing. And then you have a revolution. And then what? A new paradigm. So this is the cycle, the Kuhn cycle. And we are, in evolutionary theory, we're kind of in this, crisis box down here where it's just failed over and over and over again. And so many things have been swept under the rug, so many failed predictions, so much a lack of causality. There's no plausible cause for evolution. This is becoming an increasing problem. Things that were thought to, we'll figure that out, have actually gotten worse. So, but what I want to home in on here for this discussion is this box up here, normal science. So, okay, Kuhn explained it. This is a messy affair, especially this revolution box and this paradigm box. This is chaotic. It's not clean. It's not like you have a panel, you have rational minds working together. Instead, it's arguments and it's careers and it's funding, and people resist. There's a great resistance in science. Your seventh grade science teacher, Mr. Nelson, taught you that scientists are always testing. They're very skeptical people. They're always rejecting theories, testing, and they're ruthlessly following the evidence, and they reject a theory if it fails on the evidence. No, well, that's just a mythology. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The way science works is very conservative. You work in these funding paradigms, and you have a lot of attachment. In fact, when relativity and quantum mechanics came around about a century ago, there was a lot of resistance to those, which now we would look back on that and say, how could you possibly have resisted that? This is these were great theories, but there was a lot of resistance to the point where people were saying, they're never going to change their mind. They're never going to come around. They're just going to die. Scientists don't change their minds, they die. That was the conclusion. And I know that's kind of morbid and pessimistic, but that was what the conclusions they were coming to. They're not going to change their mind. This is really going to take hold in another generation. We have to wait for these people to these influential leaders of the field to go away. And that's the way it feels with evolution as well. There's a tremendous resistance to common sense and to empirical evidence and to the science. So it's a messy affair, and until that actually happens, the practitioners will continue to plow along in their normal science as though nothing is happening and everything is just fine, and we're just sweeping things under the rug, or we're just, we'll figure that out. So when you read papers, when you read the literature, you're going to come across these phrases, and these sentences, and these passages where they claim truth, or they claim high confidence on something which is very problematic from a scientific perspective, from a non-paradigm perspective. If I step out of the paradigm, it's like, wait a minute, this is like, how could you possibly say you have high confidence in this? There's all kinds of problems with this. But within the paradigm, yes, there is high confidence in that. And so that's called normal science. And so cheerleaders for evolution, or later evolutionists, maybe I shouldn't say cheerleaders, just later evolutionists, come along and can refer to those papers. And so citations as well. Look, we've already looked at that. So you just Google it, and you'll find all kinds of things. You'll get the explanation for bat wing evolution, whale evolution, and eukaryogenesis. It's all right there. Just Google it, and the answers are right there. And look, here's this paper. It says we have high confidence that the eukaryotes came out of this Asgard group in the archaea. It's right there. This is peer reviewed. It's a peer reviewed journal. It says they have high confidence in this. Yes, that's true. That's all true. It was peer reviewed. They do have high confidence. That's normal science. And you have to understand the concept of normal science. They're operating within a paradigm that assumes the truth of the premises and the assumptions, doesn't test those. And so if you're looking at all the problems with this paradigm, you're going to be incommensurate with the literature.
Yeah, and it's become one of my favorite things to do now to look up the evolution of whatever thing and read some of the papers on it. And then throughout the paper, it's just amazing how many admissions of all the problems and contradictions and things that you see within the published literature. But they don't question whether or not it's correct.
Exactly. That is so right, Rebekah. Yeah, so no one should be afraid of the literature or not wanting to look into it. In fact, as important as scientific knowledge is and scientific training, philosophy and theology actually are crucial to understanding and to reading the evolutionary literature. So you can pick out things like this. So if you understand normal science, you understand how to read the literature. Here is the Wikipedia to normal science, identified and elaborated by Thomas Kuhn. The regular work of scientists theorizing, observing, and experimenting within a settled paradigm. Yes, indeed. Not questioning the paradigm. In accord with established broad theory without questioning or challenging the underlying assumptions of that theory. So you could literally have a false paradigm and they would still just continue on writing these papers and creating these things. And it's a lot like, the marching band going down the blind alley in Animal House, or the Emperor's New Clothes. You just have these groups of people, this group think going on, not thinking about what they're actually saying. So the Kuhn cycle, very important.
Now, is Kuhn saying that's the normal science thing is a bad thing? Is he critiquing this cycle, or he's saying, this is the way it goes and, it's not a bad thing?
Right. It's the latter. He definitely, he's a historian. He's descriptive, not prescriptive. He's explaining how it works. In fact, other philosophers have come along and been more explicit about how, it's a very good thing. And scientific theories are not falsifiable. And they actually erect a belt of protective sub-hypotheses to protect the core theory from falsification. So you can't falsify a theory. You can only falsify the sub-hypotheses that surround it. And it's a good thing. That's the way it works, which sounds really weird. But the philosophy of science is very helpful to understanding these things. He was not saying there's anything wrong with this. And it's not meant to be a 100% universal description of all science. It doesn't always work like this, but it is a helpful concept to understand. It's generally regarded as legitimate description of a lot of science. And I think this fits evolutionary theory very well. So back to this paper, we find that eukaryotes are placed with high confidence as a well-nested clade within Asgard archaea. It's from a scientific. So I use the word, you may have, if you listen to my videos, excuse me, I use the phrase theory neutral to describe the way I'm looking at it. When I'm questioning evolution, when I'm not in the paradigm, because I'm questioning the paradigm a lot, I have to identify that. I have to explain to people I'm not in the paradigm, okay? Like, hello, I'm not in the paradigm. So I use the phrase theory neutral. That what I'm writing here, what I'm talking about, the perspective I'm taking is a theory neutral perspective. That puts me out of the paradigm. And that's important for people to understand. Okay, so with evolution, we see very high confidence in extremely low probability events. That's a very common thing in the literature. Very low probability events, but within the paradigm, from a theory neutral perspective, they are low probability. Within the paradigm, it's like, yeah, this is pretty much had to happen. Okay, so if you have that concept of normal science in mind, it becomes a lot easier to read the literature. I'm just going to go through this example of antifreeze proteins and how they evolved, and it with normal science in mind, it all of a sudden becomes much more logical and much more easier to understand. You'll see phrases and you'll see passages that might have been confusing and might have been persuasive as like, oh, gee, they really got this described here. So here is back in 2019, there's a researcher at the University of Illinois, Professor Cheng, Christina Cheng, came out with, she's actually been working on this problem of the evolution of antifreeze proteins for a long time, for like 25 years or something. And so 2019, she had another paper on this. And she was looking at an example of a fish in Antarctica, and how it has these, it's really cold down there, and it's got these antifreeze proteins. And so how did they come about? How did they evolve? And she found out that if evolution is true, within the paradigm, they must have evolved from a non-genetic, non-gene section of DNA. So more or less a, quote, random section of DNA. It didn't evolve from another gene. It evolved from non-genic elements, put it that way. Not really totally random, but not another gene. And so let me read to you, this is the PR piece before, and then look at the paper itself. So what does the PR piece say? Because that had some interesting thoughts coming from Professor Cheng and her grad student.
So they'll separate. You want me to read it?
Let me read it. Now, okay. This will go away if I keep on talking. Though separated by a world of ocean and unrelated to each other, two fish groups, one in the Arctic, the other in the Antarctic, share a surprising survival strategy. They both have evolved the ability to produce the same special brand of antifreeze protein in their tissues. Okay, so I didn't know that. Like, how do we know that they evolved these? So this is just this broad truth thing. They both evolved this. Like, that's a fact. Like, they evolved this. Okay, well, how do we know that? Oh, normal science. If it's there, it must have evolved. We discovered they have these antifreeze proteins, so therefore they evolved it. And since they're one's in the north and one's in the south, they couldn't have shared these. They must have evolved them separately. So they evolved. We know that much. Years ago, we discovered how antifreeze glycoproteins evolved in Antarctic notothenioid fishes. And we knew that the Arctic cod evolved an identical version, but not in the same way. But exactly how the codfish independently did it has remained a lasting puzzle. Okay, so there's this puzzle. So I didn't know that we discovered how antifreeze glycoproteins evolved. Okay, I know she wrote papers earlier, and I know they were about the evolution of these antifreeze proteins, but how they were very unlikely events. So this is back to normal science, talking about very unlikely events. I don't think we discovered that. I think she speculated this. And it was really, I would say, non-scientific speculation in the sense that it's just wild speculation of very unlikely events. So I wouldn't say we discovered this. I think we speculated on this. But I also understand she's operating from normal science. She's not just lying. She's operating within normal science. She and all the people that listen to her, all the people she talks to, they all talk like this, and they all share these beliefs.
Right. So they see the feature, and they see that some animals don't have the feature. They know that evolution is true, and so that feature had to evolve.
Right. Right. So then you hear these statements like, well, we discovered this. Now that's something we discovered that 20 years ago. We knew that the Arctic cod evolved an identical version. Oh, wait a minute. How do we know that? Where'd that come from? Oh, right. Normal science. So this is all normal science on a theory that has failed over and over and over again. So I say, I didn't know that. That's my way of saying, there's no evidence for this. So we're back to this concept of normal science. So with evolution, we see very high confidence in extremely low probability events. They're not lying, they're doing normal science. Okay, back to the PR piece. Its development in these fishes that make their living in icy waters occurred as a result of a series of seemingly improbable serendipitous events. So and the paper talks about this. So this, wow, it's like this happened and this happened. Wow, that's really improbable. And well, evolution is true, so that's what must have happened. So back to this idea that evolution is a history, a theory of improbable events that must be true. So we see very high confidence in very extremely low probability events. Extremely low probability, by the way. Very low. Like when I say extremely, it's really low. Going back to the PR piece, not just any random DNA sequence can produce a viable protein, let alone a life-saving one like this. So again, it's improbable. It's like, this is not just something that happens easily. You can't just take any DNA sequence and have this happen. There had to be some special serendipitous elements in there that could have been used to evolve this protein.
Well, and I just wanted to say it's amazing too how many papers, when you look up the evolution of such and such, most papers have something like that, a phrase of, even though this is extremely unlikely, or oh, the serendipity. There's so much serendipity. There's so many times when, oh, this was surprising. So it's everywhere. So
exactly. It's really common, actually. Yeah, you start to pick it out once you understand this. Quote, even if the original sequence contained the right order of building blocks that allow it to undergo transcription from DNA to RNA, that's the first step in building the protein. Several hurdles remain. Again, back to this point, this was a serendipitous, low probability event to create this protein. This is not a trivial thing. It wasn't just like, oh, it happened. Specific sequences determine whether and how genes are transcribed into RNA, how they are edited by the spliceosome, and whether they are then translated from RNA into proteins by the ribosome. So yeah, a lot of things, a lot of moving parts, a lot of things have to happen. So you have to have sequence signals enabling all this. In the case of a secreted protein, what does that mean, secreted? That means a protein that's going to leave the cell. It's not just used within the cell, it's also secreted. In the case of a secreted protein, like the antifreeze protein in codfish, a specific signal sequence also is required to process the final protein properly and maneuver it out of the cell into the bloodstream. So another thing that has to happen. So all these things have to happen, and they happen by this, they're signaled, or they are messaged by the DNA sequence. So a lot of things have to be present in this DNA sequence to make this happen. Not an easy job. The codfish antifreeze protein gene was assembled as a result of what? Several molecular events. Again, a lot of things have to happen here. These amino acid repeat, and in particular, we'll look at these repeats. Amino acid repeats have what? Just the right chemical properties to bind to ice crystals in the blood and prevent the crystals from growing. So yeah, it's not just any sequence, in addition to all these signals that have to be there to do all these steps, you also have to have the gene itself has to be just right, or, there's not a whole lot of sequences that are going to do this job. Several other serendipitous events occurred in the evolving of this gene sequence. Yeah, a lot of stuff. One bit of DNA, when edited in just the right way, after the gene is transcribed from DNA to RNA, included a sequence that tags the protein for export from the cell, the secretion. So things are happening. A random one nucleotide deletion shifted how the gene would be translated. So you had a frame shift, linking the secretion signal to the region of antifreeze repeats, making them part of the same gene. That's another little thing has to happen. A lot of serendipity. Let's look at the research paper now. So here's the paper, 2019. Christina Sheng is the last author here. Here we report clear evidence and a detailed molecular mechanism for the de novo formation of the northern codfish antifreeze glycoprotein, AFGP, gene from a minimal non-coding sequence. So what does this de novo mean? Well, that means it didn't come from another gene. So you had a gene evolved not from another gene, but from just a sequence of DNA that was non-coding. That's called de novo. And that's a hard problem. This paper explains how the antifreeze protein in the northern codfish evolved. Oh, really? That's incredible. That would be Nobel Prize. So the repeating, there's three amino acids in this protein that get repeated back to back: threonine, alanine, alanine. So that threesome is repeated over and over again several times, and that's going to do the heavy lifting in binding to these ice crystals. The antifreeze protein contains a repeating sequence of these three amino acids. The paper claims that these repeating sequences strongly suggest, quote, strongly suggest, okay, they've identified a repeating sequence. The paper says this strongly suggests that the antifreeze gene, evolved from repeated duplications of an ancestral 9-nucleotide threonine, alanine, alanine coding element. Okay, what does all this mean? So the 3 amino acids means 9 nucleotides. Remember, the codon has 3 nucleotides that codes for 1 amino acid. So if you have 3 amino acids, there's got to be 9 nucleotides in the gene that coded for those 3 amino acids. Okay, so we're back to the gene. I was talking a minute ago about the protein product that has the threonine, alanine, alanine repeating sequence. There must be a repeating 9 nucleotides over and over and over again. They don't have to be exactly the same because there's some degeneracy in the code, but you have to have these 9 nucleotides that code for threonine, alanine, alanine repeating over and over again. Okay. So
wait, can I be clear about this? The evidence they're giving for the duplication is that this uses repeating sequences.
Yeah, the mere observation, the mere observation. Oh, there's these 3 amino acids repeat over and over again. That's the evidence.
And see, that's what gets really confusing, because when I read stuff about a gene duplication, I don't know whether to believe that's a real duplication or not.
Right.
So,
right. Then you end up questioning, like, well, what do we actually know here, and what is evolutionary inference? So much is inferred from so much of it rests on the assumption that evolution is true and that the common descent is true, that you have to, what can I believe? What can't I believe? And that becomes a puzzle just in backing out what's real and what's make believe here.
Okay. So is there anything that we can look at and say, we know this was a duplication because of blank?
No, this one is not. By the way, this particular scenario is not relying on gene duplication because this one, remember, this one is not evolving from a previous gene. This one is evolving from non-genetic elements. Like there's certain, sections of DNA that happen to come
Right.
together. And then there was duplication of some of those elements. So you have a 9 nucleotide element that gets duplicated.
Okay.
So it's not a full gene duplication event, but there are micro duplication events happening here. And so I'm going to, let me look what I'm going to say.
But let's say when they say, we know this was a duplication event because there's for ones that are actually gene duplication, if they say, we know there was a duplication event because we have this like exact same gene with just a few changes, then is there anything
That would
like
be-
that can objectively tell you it's a real duplication event? Or do you just know that, or are they just assuming that because evolution is true?
I mean, you can get scenarios that are at least reasonable.
Okay.
Right? Like what you just said. It's like, well, this gene is 98% or 95% identical to this other gene. There's like 5 mutations and it's now doing this different job. It's not an unreasonable, it doesn't take too much of a stretch to say, okay, yeah, that we do know the gene duplication can occur. That's not unreasonable. A few mutations is not too unreasonable. So that's, you could look at that and say, maybe that happened. But then what inevitably usually happens, you end up piling on a multitude of unrealistic or improbable, unlikely events that must have happened. A lot of serendipity. So now let me look at this. So to read this again, the paper claims that these repeating sequences, 9 nucleotides that must have repeated over and over again, according to evolutionary theory. The paper claims that, but all we observe is these 3 amino acids get repeated over and over again in the protein. You have this protein. Oh, we got this threonine, alanine element that gets repeated all over again. That's the observable. That's what we all agree that's true. That's what's in the protein. Not the entire protein, but significant sections of this protein have this repeating threesome. So that's what we know is true. The paper claims that this evidence strongly suggests that the antifreeze gene, evolved from repeated duplications of an ancestral 9 nucleotide element. So why would the observation of these 3 amino acids strongly suggest that this evolution happened? Why would that be a conclusion? There's no reason. So let me continue with this thought here. Why does a repeating genetic sequence strongly suggest that it evolved from repeated duplications? How do you get from A to B there? What experiment revealed this? How do they know this truth? How does Professor Chang know this new truth? The answer, of course, is that there is none. There is no scientific evidence for what we just read in the paper. Zero scientific evidence for this claim that this repeating sequence strongly suggests that the antifreeze gene evolved.
Yeah, because the reason it's strongly suggesting is because they have to get from no life, then they have to get to life, and they have to build everything based on mutations. So they see repeats and they say, well, the way we get repeats is by duplication. So they're just assuming, they're trying to think of the most plausible scenario under evolution of how this would get built.
Or I agree. You got it. You nailed it. But I'll use some shorthand for what you just said. Normal science. What you just described is normal science. Professor Chang is simply in a community. They all believe this improbable, crazy theory that the entire biosphere arose spontaneously, which is straight out of Epicureanism, which is an incredible mythology. They all believe this, and so they come up with these statements. Oh, well, this strongly suggests that it evolved from repeated duplications. What experiment revealed this? None. There is zero scientific evidence for this. The paper continues with yet more such claims. Those 9 nucleotides, quote, likely originated within a pair of conserved 27 nucleotide segments that flank each side of the repetitive region. In other words, they searched through the DNA and they found other sections of DNA that have some of this similar sequence. So, that's where it came from. That's how evolution worked. Again, why is this true? How do they know this is likely? It's not likely. And these 4 27 nucleotide segments are similar to each other. Okay, so you've got these 27. You got these segments. They're similar to each other. So the paper says that indicates they resulted from the duplication of an initial copy, because you've got these different copies that are similar to each other. So they must have had a common ancestor. Why is that true? There's no scientific evidence for that. Why do such similarities imply an origin via evolutionary mechanisms? The problem is they don't. There's no empirical evidence for any of this. This is evidence-free. The evolutionists next explained that the 9 nucleotide segment duplicated a large number of times because it worked well. Quote, we hypothesize that upon the onset of selective pressure from cold polar marine conditions, in other words, the population migrated toward the pole. It got closer to, it entered colder and colder waters. Okay. So you had the onset of selective pressure from cold polar marine conditions. In other words, cold water, to put it simply. Duplications of a 9 nucleotide ancestral element in the midst of the 4 GCA-rich duplicates occurred. Okay, what I want to point out there is this phrase, selective pressure. I've talked about this before. This is false, even within the paradigm. So you find normal science violating science outside the paradigm. So the paradigm is weak and it's failing, and there's all sorts of from a theory neutral perspective. There's all kinds of problems, but there's also, you find problems within the paradigm, even accepting the paradigm. This is a false, because they get lazy and they get desperate because it's not working. So this is not how selective pressure works. So this is false. You don't, what the paper is saying is, they got into colder water and that exerted a pressure that caused the duplication of this 9 nucleotide element, because alone it's not going to do the job. It doesn't bind to ice crystals. You need to have a bunch of them duplicated back to back, tail to head to tail, such that you then obtain the ability to bind to ice crystals. So the cold water applied the pressure to have that happen. No, that's teleological. That's not evolutionary theory. They're violating, and this happens over and over and over again in the literature. This is not a problem with the normal science that I was describing before. This is a problem even within normal science. They are violating evolutionary theory because they're so desperate to try and make it work and make it sound logical. So they use this metaphor all the time. Oh, well, it was selective pressure. No, that's not how selective pressure works. It doesn't induce mutations to happen. It doesn't.
Right. Because really what that's saying is there was somehow an awareness, and we can't insert a mind in here, right? Because there's no mind. So you don't have a mind to say, hey, it's really cold. We need some antifreeze. Let's just evolve it, right? There's no mechanism for doing that. So you're saying the selective pressure comes later. Like if something accidentally happens, then, there's the selection of what is best. Of course, that organism will reproduce and, continue on instead of dying out. But it doesn't work in the pre, because there's
nothing to select from.
Right.
The term selective pressure or selection pressure is a totally legitimate concept within evolutionary theory. Within classic evolutionary theory, selection pressure is a totally legitimate concept. Now, I think evolution is false because it fails on the science. But within that theory, there's nothing wrong with the concept of selection pressure. And what it means is when you have existing phenotypes or existing two different existing structures within biology, and you now have the onset of some different environment, it might favors one over the other. The fitness, the reproductive differential is better for one structure than the other structure. This one helps you have more babies. And so that is a selection pressure. But they're pre-existing. The environmental change comes after. So you already have these pre-existing designs to choose from. It can't create new designs. It doesn't create new structures. It doesn't create new species. It doesn't create new organelles. It doesn't create new body plans. It doesn't do those things that the literature is constantly ascribing to it. So it's what it really is teleology. It's teleological. It is saying, it's goal directed. This is an example of the teleology that pervades evolution. It was upon the onset of cold conditions that the needed genetic duplications occurred. This is goal seeking. So evolution is goal directed. The paper continues with moving on. The paper continues with a series of one-time contingent events crucial to their story. The genetic sequence, quote, was appropriately delimited by an existing in-frame termination codon. Appropriately delimited? That sounds like a mind. All right, that's a mind. The absence of a thymine nucleotide, the absence of a thymine nucleotide at a location in some of the species, quote, very likely resulted from a deletion event, causing a fortuitous frame shift, which supplied the crucial signal peptide segment telling cellular machinery that the protein should be secreted to the bloodstream. So that was in the press release. We talked about this. This is in the paper now. So yeah, it just happened. This is serendipity. As the paper concludes, quote, the emerging AFGP gene was thus endowed with the necessary secretory signal. Endowed with the necessary secretory signal. Again, this is a mind. This is teleological language. In summary, this antifreeze protein is an example of, quote, evolutionary ingenuity. That was straight out of the paper. Yeah, exactly. You just shake your head. This is so blatant. Evolutionists then later refer to papers like this as proof of evolution. So cheerleaders, evolutionists, PR, journalists, whoever, bloggers, come along. Hey, look, I Googled it. Look at this paper. It shows this. Now, there's several other papers on antifreeze protein evolution. They're not, this is one of several, but they all follow this sort of laziness and failure. I'm just going by the science here. I want to promote the science, and evolutionists will oh well, you're just this or you're just that. That's what they say because they don't have the science to back them up. Religion drives science, and it matters.
Yeah, wow. And for those watching, I am not shaking my head at the word ingenuity because these features, like the antifreeze, clearly show ingenuity. But ingenuity and evolution are not supposed to go together. Ingenuity requires a mind, and evolution doesn't have a mind. Now, some people will say, yeah, but you see, natural selection almost works like a mind because it just selects from, it selects from what's already present. But the problem is getting to that point. How do you get to having these antifreeze proteins? How do you get to having this whole system? And that is the point where in the paper, like Dr. Hunter is showing, they keep appealing to these forces that require a mind, but then they want it to fit into evolution theory, which it doesn't, because evolution is supposed to be how we got all of this biodiversity by chemical and physical natural processes, no mind involved. So
Exactly. And so it's really disappointing that what you get is pushback when you point these things out. Evolution is just like Mr. Nelson taught us in 7th grade. They should be all over this. They should, oh my gosh, you're right. When you read things like that in papers like this, you should drop the paper immediately. You should reject the paper right out of hand. Oh, this is not science. No one should be taking this seriously. But unfortunately, what you get from evolutionists is pushback, and you get theory protectionism. So what they will protect the theory at all costs. And so this gets back to the example of the quantum mechanics and relativity a century ago, where they realized these guys aren't about science. They're not about truth. They're not about following the data. They're about protectionism. And so you encounter that a lot with evolutionists. It's not a willingness or an interest to follow the data. It's not an interest in science. It's an interest in this theory and protecting the theory.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic of this paper, because I just scanned the paper before we did this, and I noticed a few really interesting things. Number one is that this happened in 4 separate lineages, right? And so another example, as I've seen in like every branch of the evolutionary tree I look at, where you have the same feature arising multiple times. Now, even one time is incredibly unlikely, like probably impossible, but let's just say very, very implausible. And now you've got it in 4 separate lineages. And one thing that they said, that this is quoting, it's like rare, they consider this an example of rare protein sequence convergence. So, I mean, so yeah, so like basically it's like got the same protein sequence in these divergent lineages. And so like it, a lot of times when this convergent evolution happens, it'll arise in a different, like well, I'm assuming the theory for the moment, but according to the theory, it happens, in a different gene or something like that. But this, they're actually saying it's the protein sequence is the same.
Yeah, and it's not identical. It's not exactly the same,
Okay.
but it's sufficiently similar. I mean, in molecular biology, if you're even 50% similar, it's way beyond random, and it's got to be. You can't explain that by just random chance. It has to have something's going on. In this case, I think there's sections of these proteins that are very similar, 70-80% similar, something like that. I haven't looked at the data exactly, but there are very similar sections. So that's why they say convergent, a rare case of convergent protein sequence convergence, because it's very significantly similar. What's interesting is, if you're an evolutionist, how would they have predicted this? And it's always helpful to look at what are the predictions of evolution, because evolutionists will always react to the latest findings. Oh, right. Well, that evolved this way. And all of a sudden, all of previous failures are swept under the rug. So the history of the predictions is helpful. If you told an evolutionist, well, there's going to be these antifreeze proteins that must have evolved convergently because in separate populations on separate sides of the earth, they would have said, well, okay, they're convergent, but there's probably a similarity in how they evolved. Well, that failed. There's this other example on the other side of the earth of a gene duplication event. That's the theory, is that the antifreeze, they trace the similarities to an existing gene. Trypsinogen is the gene. This is a precursor to trypsin, which is a digestive enzyme. And so they trace it, they see the similarities to trypsinogen. So they say, oh, well, you had a gene duplication event, and then it evolved from that. And again, there's a sequence of unlikely, improbable events that had to have happened to create that. It's not just one or two mutations. But there's enough similarities to that other sequence that they say, oh, that's the evolutionary lineage. We've showed that it evolved from the trypsinogen. Well, that's a totally different evolutionary pathway. So adopting the paradigm for the moment, operating within normal science, you're now calling on a completely different pathway to the creation of this one antifreeze protein in a fish on one side of the earth and the other side. We just looked at this other example, which is it didn't come from another gene. It came from non-genetic elements in the DNA that were cobbled together under selection pressure and put together. And then all these improbable serendipitous events happen to form this entire gene with all the signaling sequences necessary to transcribe it and edit it and translate it and secrete it. There's 4 major steps that have to happen in addition to just forming the gene itself. All this has to happen for the case we just looked at. Then you have this other case, or this one came from an existing gene with a whole bunch of improbable events. But it's a completely different pathway, which, to your point, Rebekah, is like, well, it was improbable in one case. It would have at least kind of thought would be a similar way of doing it, but no, it's completely different if evolution is true. So it's not serendipity. It's not parsimonious at all. You don't have a theory that's kind of falling into place. It's having to just react to the latest findings. Oh, well, we found this. Okay, well, that changes everything. This happened this way this time. So it becomes a tautology. Whatever we discover, oh, well, it evolved that way. Oh, this time it evolved differently. Nothing ever works according to what we thought it was going to happen, but that's evolution for you.
Okay. Now, in the paper, it mentioned like this evolving recently. Now, do they mean evolution recently? Like, or do they mean that there was a fish species that didn't have this and now we see it?
I would have to go look at that particular passage. I don't remember that,
Okay.
but I think what they mean by that is, if they're saying recently, it's not when the fish species first arose, but later in its evolutionary history.
Right. Evolution recently, not our observations recently.
Yeah.
So they actually don't know that this came about because, if God created, those fish could have always had that.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't mean something like in the last 1,000 years or something like that. I think I'm pretty sure.
Okay. I was just wondering, have we observed it? This would be something good to look into. Like, is there a fish species that we know of that, doesn't have it and then got it? Because,
Yeah. There's definitely, that's the thing about biology. There's no rules. It's the only rule in biology is there's no rules. And so evolution depends on, common descent and how there's these patterns. And this came from an ancestor, and it's shared with my evolutionary neighbors. And so there's all these rules that you can have. Well, it turns out those always fail. Everything is lineage specific or species specific. This is different. Oh, this doesn't match up with my cousin, my evolutionary cousin. The common descent pattern isn't working. It's always exceptions. And what it looks a lot like is design, not common descent, but different designs.
Okay. Can I ask about the eukaryogenesis? Because there's so much, like, I always hear about this, like, okay, we think that, the way that they say, it happened is that there was like some kind of ancestor of prokaryotes. And what happened is, to make the eukaryote, is the eukaryote enveloped it and then that's how we got eukaryotes. And you were talking about how we would need a line, like, a progression, like some sort of being able to see, in the fossil record, something like this happening, and we don't have that. But I mean, can't they just say, well, it happened all in one event, so hey, we don't have a progression?
So no, and let me just go back to your fossil record comment. So
Okay.
seeing a continual, gradual evolution in the fossil record would be a wonderful, fantastic thing for evolution, but that's not necessarily required. Another way to do it would be to say, okay, we don't have fossils of it, but we can in the lab create these things. We have eukaryotes, we have prokaryotes, we have the ability, we have genetic engineering abilities. So we can go in there and, with mutagenesis, create mutations and literally evolve our way from one to the other. If it was that easy, if there really was a continuous path, we could show that. We could even maybe, if you really want to stretch it a little bit, do it computationally. That's probably beyond our capabilities right now, but you could envision computational models showing, the mitochondria could have evolved this way. The centriole could have evolved this way. The nucleus could have evolved this way. We computationally can kind of show that you don't need to have more than one or two mutations at a time, right? You can do one or two at a time, and there's this really kind of obvious pathway from A to B. So numerically, computationally, in silico, we can show how evolution could have worked. That would be pretty good. It may not be totally convincing because it's, in computer, but at least it would, if it was sufficiently detailed, that would be pretty good. So we just don't have anything close to any of those. But if evolution really was true, we would expect that. If blind chance could create the world, that's pretty simple. That's a pretty dumb search mechanism. That's a pretty dumb mechanism for causing, the entire biosphere. It should be kind of obvious. We shouldn't be always running into, there's just no way we could ever actually get the details of this because it's way too complicated. And the gaps are just too enormous. So what we have is, so what you just finished up there with, Rebekah, was, can't they just show it happen like in one fell swoop or something? No, because there's just too many multiple mutations required at once. You can't have more than, when you have, so under evolutionary theory, with each mutation, you have to have an improvement or at least a not degrading fitness. You can have some random drift, so things kind of float around. That's not a very good search mechanism. But ultimately, at some point, you have to have increasing fitness occur such that these mutations will be selected for. And so you can't, now, if you have a mutation that occurs and it doesn't help the fitness, there's a good chance it's just going to go away. Well, there's a chance that it's going to go away, put it that way. You need, in order to hold on to these mutations, it really helps if they are selected for, if they're increasing fitness. If you have to have, let's say in order to increase fitness, you have to have two mutations occur. One mutation doesn't do it, the other doesn't do it. But if you have two of these mutations, they will increase fitness. Okay, well, that's good, except the chances of having two mutations occur simultaneously. They have to occur simultaneously. If you have just one or just the other, it's not going to help. You have to have both in a particular individual in the population. That individual has to have these two mutations. Okay, having two mutations occur is not like super unlikely. It's definitely less likely than just one. What if you need three? What if you need three mutations to occur to improve the fitness? Oh, well, three simultaneous, this one, and this one have to happen in the same individual. When that individual is born, it has to have these three. That's getting pretty unlikely. What if it's four? What if it's five? Now it's just, forget it. I mean, you can't have five specific mutations happen and be required for evolution to proceed. That's just too unlikely. Well, the kind of things we're talking when you to get to eukaryotes, we're not talking about 4 or 5 or 6. We're talking about 4 or 5 million or 4 or 5 billion. We're just the number of mutations required is just astronomical. So that can't happen under evolutionary theory. So you have to have this gradual process of 1 or 2 mutations at a time that provide, an ever increasing fitness. And yeah, you can have some drift also. That's fine. Not all these mutations have to provide a fitness improvement. But then you're left with a very inefficient search mechanism. You can't have too much of that because you're just drifting all over the place. And even the ones you got can go away and such. So the bottom line is it's just you can't, in order for evolution to work, there has to be these smooth, gradual pathways from A to B. And that doesn't exist between prokaryotes and eukaryotes or archaea and eukaryotes. We don't have that. That's why there's no details. That's why you have these cartoon level scenarios, but you don't ever have any details behind it because they can't do it. And so that should be a red flag for evolutionists. They say, well, this isn't working. And it's not just true for eukaryogenesis, it's true for all those other levels as well. Reptiles and fish and amphibians and so forth. You just can't get from A to B with the resources that evolutionary theory gives you. And evolutionists have not reckoned with this. They don't reckon with the reality. We know a lot more now than Darwin ever knew. He could kind of speculate and kind of dream, which is what he was doing. We can't do that anymore. We don't have the luxury of that. We know too much. It's failed. It's completely failed. It does not work. And so you're either in a position of protecting the theory and you're taking the wrong side of history or pointing these problems out.
Yeah. Well, we have some comments related to this. Should I bring them up?
Okay.
So Johnny Atheist says endosymbiosis is a major component of the updated EES evolutionary model.
Yeah, for sure. So the idea of fusing these things together, maybe the mitochondria came about by a prokaryote getting gobbled up into another cell, and that led to the eukaryotes. So yeah, endosymbiosis is a mechanism, one of many explanatory mechanisms to get you from A to B. It is only a minor step. I mean, it's a major. If that could happen, that'd be a major step. But he's talking about the extended evolutionary synthesis, EES. Of course, the major the theoretical development in the mid 1900s was the evolutionary synthesis. So that didn't work. That failed miserably, even though it was claimed to be a fact, a undeniable fact. You had to be, a nut to deny the extended, the evolutionary synthesis. That's what we were all taught. Of course, that failed. It failed miserably. And so now, what do we do? Well, let's add an E there. So now we have the extended evolutionary synthesis. Well, that doesn't work either. They're trying, and okay, that's what they're going to do. Evolutionists do what evolutionists do. They're trying. And so there's now a whole bunch of competing 3-letter acronyms or others that are trying to be the new evolutionary theory because it didn't work. So yeah, they're trying. That's also a sign that it's failing, and that there's a reason why there's many of them, because none of them work. So yeah, endosymbiosis is a major component, no question about it, of that, or at least a component of the updated EES evolutionary model.
So I think this
Yeah,
is
we see it occurring. Yeah, there's no problem, no question. Mutations occur also. All kinds of things occur. Things happen. Evolution is not static. Things change. We see lateral gene transfer, horizontal gene transfer. We see all kinds of things happening. Endosymbiosis, yes, it's occurring today. That doesn't mean it does the job in describing how evolution could occur. It doesn't. It is
because endosymbiosis is just two organisms that kind of are living together in a symbiotic relationship, right? I mean,
right. Yeah, and then you can have one fusing into another, So maybe a prokaryote got gobbled up into another cell, and that led to the mitochondria and so forth. So, I mean, these are wild speculations when you start to use endosymbiosis to actually support the evolution of eukaryotes. Look, everybody, you need to reckon with this. Endosymbiosis does not solve eukaryogenesis. That is not all of a sudden the golden solution that we now know how eukaryogenesis works. It's endosymbiosis. No, that's not sufficient. It's woefully insufficient. Yeah, it is another mechanism. Evolutionists have dozens and dozens and dozens of explanatory mechanisms that they have drawn upon in the literature to try and explain this. None of these have worked, and eukaryogenesis is not explained. There is no, even evolutionists, serious evolutionists who are willing to state the state of the science agree, yeah, there are gaps. There are long stretches without intermediates. We do not have a detailed scientific explanation for the evolution of eukaryotes. The eukaryogenesis problem is not solved.
And Mefrishad says, when I study the genetic coordination between mitochondria and chloroplasts with the nuclear genome, I really doubt they have evolved by a random organelle engulfment.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Random organelle engulfment. I like that one. So yeah, it's when you look, that's right. When you look at it from a theory neutral perspective and look at the details, it's like, there's really more to it than what the evolutionists are attempting to explain.
Now, Andrew says we are now discovering archaea that have many precursor structures to eukaryotes.
Yeah. And so if you look at the history of the eukaryogenesis problem, practically every conceptual architecture has been floated. Maybe the prokaryotes evolved from eukaryotes. So it's the exact reverse. Maybe this happened, maybe that happened. So all kinds of diagrams have been drawn to try and illustrate how the prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and archaea are related. And are we discovering archaea that have many precursor structures to eukaryotes? Sure. So that still doesn't do the job in explaining eukaryogenesis.
Isn't even using the word precursor an assumption of the evolutionary scenario? Because, I mean, just because it has the feature doesn't mean that it was like going in the evolutionary path. So
that's a really good point, Rebekah. There is the language contains an assumption or an inference or an implied history there. Oh, it's a precursor to the eukaryotes. Well, maybe it's just a different solution that archaea needed. Archaea have something. They have structures in them to solve similar problems. They have similar structures that the eukaryotes have. Yeah. So what? That doesn't. We still have huge expanses without intermediates between the two. That doesn't do the job. It's like, oh, there's a precursor there. So ultimately, what this, there's buried in. It's a very good comment you made, Rebekah, because buried in that language are theological assumptions about, that wouldn't exist if God made it that way. We wouldn't see these similarities. So we get back to the principle of plenitude and sufficient reason in these, which most evolutionists have no idea that's what they're resting on. But there's no reason why that would be. Oh, there's something similar in archaea, so that means they evolved. They must have evolved. Like, no, that doesn't. There's what scientific experiment do you have to show that? This is just God of the gaps.
Yeah, and this is sort of, I mean, I find this comment ironic because it's actually, we've been talking about science, but, so I think this is Austin. He says, this is just God of the gaps. This is little more than a sermon dressed up as a science discussion.
Yeah, the irony is evolutionary theory is the sermon. Evolutionary theory is mandated by theology. It's mandated by religion. It is a religious theory. The science is the handmaiden. The science has been recruited to support the theology. And so what I'm doing is pointing out the scientific problems with the religious theory. So to call that a sermon as dressed up as a science discussion is theory protectionism. So we have evolutionists who will not reckon with the actual history, the scientific problems, and the role that theology, the critical role that theology plays in evolutionary theory. Instead, they will do theory protectionism, where, oh no, you're the one, you're doing this, you're doing that. And as you say, it's ironic. I'm not talking about theology at all. It's like, well, how'd you get that? Where's the sermon? I didn't. There's nothing when you talk about the scientific problems with evolution. There's no theological component. I don't really care if God used evolution or didn't use evolution. That's not. That's not part of the analysis. Maybe evolution is true. Maybe God used. So from a theological perspective, I'm neutral on that. I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. It doesn't matter whether Jesus used evolution or didn't use evolution to create the world. Maybe he did. Like, okay, fine. That's interesting. I'm not saying it's not interesting, but it's not. I don't reject either one. Either one's possible. So there's no theological component to the scientific problems with evolution.
Okay, I guess this is the new viewer. Welcome, Dell. What is this channel about? This channel is about talking about origins, and in particular, evolution. And I believe evolution is false. Dr. Hunter believes evolution is false. And we're trying to show people the scientific reasons to reject evolution, that evolution is not the scientific truth that people are repeatedly instructed that it is. So that's what we're here to talk about.
And then to add to that, there's this question, Dell, of, okay, well, if it's false, if it's bad science, why are all these evolutionists out there? Why do all the life scientists in the world believe in evolution? Well, they don't all believe in evolution, but it's a very popular theory. Why are there so many evolutionists? If it's false, what's going on? So that's what we're explaining, is why would people believe in evolution if from a scientific perspective it fails so badly?
Yes. And so Andrew says, though, you aren't neutral then. You're basing one conclusion or another off of your Christian theology.
No, that's not true. No, I'm not. From a theological perspective, I'm not preferring one solution over another. So that's what I mean when I say I'm neutral. If you're saying I'm not neutral because I'm scientifically driven, then yes, that's true. I'm following the evidence. I'm following the empirical science. So to me, that's the language that we all should agree on. We all understand science, so we should follow that. You are basing one conclusion or another off of your Christian theology. No, I guess what is it about? I don't care whether God used evolution or not. What is it about that you don't understand?
Okay. Now, this comment came in before the stream that I loved. Cornelius the goat. Now, do you know what I had to look this up because I'm not familiar with all the new terminology.
Yes, I know that because Michael Jordan is the GOAT.
Okay, yes, greatest of all time. And you know what? I have to say, Dr. Hunter, you have really opened my mind in the past year reading your books and listening to you talk. Really, there are so many things that I was not aware of. And one of those is this thing that evolution is so much religiously based. I did not understand that. And most people, when they hear that, they kind of like, well, no, it's not, this is all science. I've had to think about that a lot this year. And I'm really starting to see that it's true.
Good. Thank you, Rebekah. Or they say, Oh, right. Of course it's religiously based. It's atheism. It's secular humanism. It's materialism. And I tell you, I mean, I just had a long discussion with a good acquaintance, professional acquaintance, who's a really sharp guy about this. And, he's just totally holding that line of like, it's materialism, and I'm explaining this over and over again. There's a very strong resistance to understanding evolution as a theological theory that comes from Christians. Now, before the Christians, you had the Epicureans, so it's not just Christians. But this isn't atheism like Charles Hodge concluded in the 19th century, or many, many people before and since have argued. Atheism is a bit player in all of this. It's not important. Nobody, a small fraction of the people believe in atheism, and it's not an important player. Religion and theology are the powerful players, and that's what's driving this. And in our world, say the last 500 years, because we're mostly influenced by, say the last, modern, the period of modernism, it's been Christians and Christianity that has driven this, mostly Anglicans and Lutherans. You have a few Roman Catholics thrown in here and there for good measure, but it's been mainly Anglicans and Lutherans advancing these Epicurean ideas with way more detail and way more elaboration, sophistication, that by the time you get to Charles Darwin in the 19th century, the foundation has been laid. And he never had to justify his theological proclamations. They were a given by that time. Of course, God wouldn't do this or that. He could write very vaguely. And so now, when I say it's Christian or it comes from Christians, I'm not saying it's biblical. It's not biblical. These and it's in a very subtle way. And so when you look at sects, Christian sects, I'm not saying sex, I'm saying sects, sects. When you look at all and the heresies and the false churches that abound, they entail a lot of these crazy or these non-biblical ideas that are very, actually crazy. What I should say is appealing. They are seductive. They're deceptive. So a lot of churches you go to and there'll be non-biblical teachings. And some of these are the same as what you find in evolution. So we are very, very.
But I want to interrupt you here because there's a lot of people who have never heard you talk before. And what they're going to think you're saying here is that you're saying they're being non-biblical because they're not taking a literal interpretation of Genesis. Okay. That's what they're thinking.
Right.
I want to make it clear for people who are watching, Dr. Hunter is not talking about that at all. He's talking about ideas that we hold about God that don't really come from the Bible's description of the character of God. And it's based on this whole theological framework. And the way that he's saying that evolution is theological is that the strong evidence that is put forward for evolution is based on this theological framework about what God would and wouldn't do. And so am I expressing that well? Am I clarifying that?
I'm really glad you interjected on that. I was oblivious to that for a second there. And you expressed it very well, although it gets a lot more complicated. It's not what God would and wouldn't do is a good kind of general label for these traditions, but there really are a dozen or more traditions that get into the substance and the details of this, and some of them are deviations on that, or different ideas on this. So it's not exactly what God would or wouldn't do, but that's a good way of summarizing it. And so, there's a lot of detailed. These dozen or more, I say there's about 14 of these traditions that have been elaborated on by the Lutherans and Anglicans mainly, and they're non-biblical. And so when you say someone is a Christian, well, that means they follow the Bible. But guess what? Most Christians aren't perfect at that, and we're not quite right. There was the thief on the cross who said, "Remember me, Jesus, in your kingdom." And sure enough, Jesus said, "Yeah, I will. We will be in paradise together today." And that thief didn't have his theology right. I'll bet you 10 to 1. I'll bet he didn't understand everything about God's revealed word and all the
Mhm.
theology right. And so that wasn't, you don't have to have everything straight. Thank God. I'm sure I don't have everything straight. Um, so when I'm saying these Christians are advocating, promoting, demanding, mandating non-biblical theological traditions, I'm not saying they're not Christians. I'm not saying they're good Christians or bad Christians. They self-identify as Christians, and so I say they're Christians, and they're probably Christians who don't do everything quite right. So I'm not judging these people. I'm just reporting on the facts, reporting on the history of what's going on here.
Yes. Okay. And I wanted to put up this. I think this is Ian. I'm not sure the name on this, but it says, Rebekah, when do you announce future live talks? I try to give at least 1 day in advance and sometimes 2 days in advance. And basically, if you have your notifications for my channel, if you have the notifications bell, and then hopefully YouTube will send you a notification. But they don't always. But I just recommend checking my channel and just looking to see if there's an upcoming live, because it should show right on my home screen that there will be an upcoming live stream. So I try to make that at least a day in advance, and sometimes more than that in advance. So thank you for your interest, and I would love to have you come on sometime. And he or she says, I'm going to read the paper and do a reaction video, maybe on Endo also. Okay, great. We look forward to that. And I don't mind at all when, people have criticisms. I receive criticisms, and I'm happy to, be corrected if there's anything that we've said that's incorrect. So
Yeah,
you're
for
welcome.
sure.
Okay, now Andrew's confused because he says, so you want to consider God in the equation, but also keep him out of it. Which is it?
So what is it? What did I say that makes you think I want us to consider God in the equation? When you say the equation, I assume you mean the theory of origins. So what I talk about is the science of the life sciences and physics and how they bear on evolutionary theories. So that's all science. Now, because those theories fail so badly, I have to ask the question, why? What's going on here? Why do people believe in this? Why do really smart people insist that it's a fact when it's obviously a failed scientific theory? And so to answer that question, I read what they write. That's all. I just read the literature because they're very open about what they believe in their arguments, and their arguments are religious. So that's the religion comes into the picture from the evolutionists, okay, not from me. So do I want us to consider God? Yeah, we have to consider God because that's what the evolutionists are arguing about. That's what their theory is founded on. So yeah, we need to consider God. You need to understand that because that's what evolution is based on.
And a lot of people will hear that and say, no, this is pure science, pure science. It has nothing to do with God. And we understand where you're coming from, but think deeper. You have to pay attention to what the actual core of the arguments are.
That's the
And
deception.
yeah,
That's the deception. That is
because
exactly
when I
the
first heard
deception.
Dr. Hunter say this, I was like, what's he talking about? It's kind of it went over my head. And I've had to think about it for months and months and months and read both of his books. So I'm finally starting to get it now.
I will tell you that, when I was researching this, when I first began my research, my interest grew in this area. I didn't believe it either. And it was like, wait a minute, this can't be quite right. And this is just, I went through all the arguments that the evolutionists present. Oh, it's just a sideshow, and it's just a sidebar, and this is just a lazy evolutionist and all this. No, it didn't turn out that way, but it took years for me to build that case and really understand what's going on with evolution, what actually is evolution, because all those arguments and all those defenses don't work. They all fail. And so if you honestly reckon with those, and you're not in theory defense mode and theory protectionism mode, and instead of trying to attack the messenger, actually consider what's actually going on, because the theory of evolution is, when you actually look at it from a theory neutral perspective, absurd. And I use that word in an objective way. I know that word gets thrown around. Oh, that's absurd. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean, words have appropriate times, and this is an appropriate application of the word absurd. The idea that the entire biosphere, and actually by extension the entire world, the universe, evolved spontaneously by itself, is, from a scientific perspective, absurd. It makes no sense. It's totally ridiculous. I know it's hard to get to that point. The deception is so powerful and so strong. It's hard to change your zeitgeist and look at it from a theory perspective and realize, oh, wow, this is like, I was so deceived. This is incredible. And then once you allow yourself to see that, it's hard to unsee. And you realize every textbook, every lecture you've sat through, that was all refutations of evolution. When you look at biology from a theory neutral perspective, it's mind blowing, and it doesn't make any sense at all under evolutionary theory. That is the incredible deception we're under.
Yeah. Now, Faithless Morality says, as an actual scientist who runs a lab and uses the scientific model while doing research all the time, God never comes into any of this ever.
Oh, wonderful. I am so happy to hear that. So you must not be an evolutionist then. You must have rejected evolution out of hand, since God is not part of your thinking. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Faithless Morality. I'm glad to see there's some progress out there.
Okay. So, and we do actually hope that you are paying attention to the science on this, and we are hoping that people will start actually questioning and challenging the core, the basis of what you've been taught, what your assumptions are about what's going on. So, and another one, a similar comment: no, evolution has nothing to do with God. Evolution is true whether or not a god, goddess, or entire pantheons of deities exist.
So, well, the existence of can you keep it up?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
That was a good comment there.
Okay. I have to find it again. Just go ahead and start responding.
Okay. Maybe you don't.
Okay.
If you can't find it, it's okay. But so I guess, one question there. Good job. It's not the existence of God that's in question here, or required. There's no presumption of the existence of the metaphysical. It's the if he existed. Okay, so that is a religious belief. It's not contingent on the existence of God. It's not an ontological question. It is if God exists, then he would do things this way. And that is not a scientific claim. That is a theological claim. And so you have to kind of reorient your thinking there a little bit. And so I guess I would ask you, what did Darwin mean in chapter 6 of Origins when he talked about how he and his theory are committed to theological utilitarianism? So that was his chapter his first chapter on dealing with the problems and objections with the theory. And he clearly stated that he is a utilitarian, and his theory was staked to utilitarianism. And by utilitarianism, he's talking about theological utilitarianism, and if God created the biological world, the world in general, everything would be perfectly adapted. That's theological utilitarianism, which is one of the dozen theological traditions evolution is built on. And so when you say, no, evolution has nothing to do with God, that contradicts theological utilitarianism, which Darwin and his theory were staked to. And by the way, it's not just Darwin. It was before Darwin, and it was after Darwin, and it goes on up to today. So evolutionists today continue to make these arguments about of this coming from theological utilitarianism. So when you say it has nothing to do with God, I'm afraid you have not reckoning with the literature and the theory that we're actually dealing with. I think you have in mind a different theory. You're muted.
Sorry. This is what Mehrshad says, getting back to the science. Okay. He says, we routinely observe gene duplication as a mutation event, but generating new function from another copy is only an assumption by phylogeny.
That's a good point.
Mehrshad.
Yep. Good point.
Yep. Okay. And so Ian says, biologists see many examples of repeated sequences being produced from well understood mechanisms.
Yeah, sure. No problem with that. No, that doesn't solve the eukaryogenesis problem. That's not the golden solution.
And I'm getting these comments from earlier in our stream. So when we were still talking about the science, Tyler says, what is he saying? That indels can't occur naturally?
No. And I was clear that insertions and deletions can occur. I would talk at length about that. The problem is, maybe you're stemming off of that discussion I had. So it's not that they can't occur naturally. It's that it's unlikely that they would be, you can't have an accumulation of them to create new complexity, like, a wing or a mitochondria or a eukaryote. So it's to have those, a long stretch of thousands and millions of those indels to leading to new complexity is an unlikely event to occur from a scientific perspective. So they can occur. The problem is you need to have a whole bunch of them occur to create this new structure. So you can't just build just so stories. You can't just say, oh, well, indels occur naturally, so therefore, they could lead to this new bow plan or new organelle or new gene. No, there's the statistical mechanics involved do not allow that. The entropic barriers are enormous. We live in a universe where complexity doesn't just fall together normally. It just doesn't happen.
Okay. Ian says I think this is Ian. Her point is valid, but the fact, and I think he's talking about the author of the paper, but the fact that the proteins are different, or maybe he's talking about me, I don't know. Proteins are different in different lineages is evidence for evolution. And this is a follow-on prediction. Antifreeze proteins on inverts would be completely different.
So you can, we're talking about retro predictions here, because no such prediction was ever made. And I was talking about how under evolutionary theory, you'd think there would at least be some similarity. You can make the argument that no, it's a different side of the world, so they're going to be different. It's hard to say, because I don't think, sometimes retro predictions are obvious and compelling. Other times it's more speculative. So you could say that maybe that's true. Maybe that's I don't think that's an obvious prediction, but you could. I'm trying to be open-minded and giving evolution every break in the world here, so that I'm not overstretching things. So it's the prediction that they would evolve through similar pathways. That's, maybe you can argue against that. I get that.
Okay, now this, for those who have been confused about what Dr. Hunter has been saying about evolution being religious, theological, this might be a good example of this type of thinking that we're talking about that seems scientific, but it actually has a theological basis. So the comment is from faithless morality, and says, Cornelius, if evolution is not real, please explain how the Hox gene has been misunderstood. If alleles find different locus points, what have we gotten wrong about those effects all this time?
I'd have to think about the details of this. If Hox genes is misunderstood, if alleles find different locus points, what have we gotten wrong about those effects all this time? Yeah, I have the first thing you need to do anytime you're dealing with evolutionists is reconstruct what they're saying and try and understand the details of what they're saying. And I'm not sure what this evolutionist is saying.
Okay, and okay, I'm gonna guess because, and it's very hard to communicate in chat to get a point across in chat. So I'm just gonna I don't know what he means about the second point, the second part, but like the Hox genes are often promoted as, hey, like, look, if this is evidence for evolution because we have Hox genes that we find, the same gene in all of these different organisms, and it's all, about the body plan and everything. And so this shows common ancestry. Like, this is evidence for common ancestry because of these shared genes. And so that appears very scientific, but it's,
let me interject. So I think it is for this. I think it stems from the Evo-Devo arguments or the Evo-Devo research area, evolution and development. And there's all kinds of interesting evidence from the embryonic development of individuals and how they're different in different species. And so this Hox gene is an important part of embryonic development, Hox genes. And I'm supposing what the point here is, as you said, Rebekah, there's similar genes in different species. So a mouse and a whale might have a similar gene in their embryonic development. I know that you can take certain genes, embryonic development genes important in the embryonic development process, and transplant them from one species to another, and it still works perfectly fine. Maybe even a distant species, and it still works perfectly fine. That because I know I've seen that used as powerful evidence for evolution. So maybe that's what this evolutionist is asking: is how did we misunderstand that? What's the misunderstanding? What did we get wrong about that? But I'm not exactly sure if that's what he's talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So faithless morality, we don't know if we're understanding your question properly, but the way that I have heard this presented with the Hox gene as evidence for evolution is the theological thing that you're talking about, where it's like, it's the idea that, hey, we see these similar genes in similar organisms, and we wouldn't see that if, common ancestry weren't true. Right. And so that is actually but why wouldn't we see that if common ancestry weren't true? What would we be looking for? Like, how does that favor common ancestry over another type, separate ancestry? How does it favor it? Well, it doesn't, because if God created the world, he can create Hox genes in as many organisms as he wants, right? So it's just as likely that God created those Hox genes as Hox genes coming from common ancestry. But the way that you get it to be evidence for evolution is because you say, why would God do it that way? It can't be God. God wouldn't do this. God wouldn't be deceptive and make it look like common ancestry. These are actually things that I've heard people say. So I'm not just making this up. So but
Right.
you have to like get below, like, why is it actually evidence for common ancestry? So what do you have
I
any
think I think
comment
you're
on that?
probably right, Rebecca. This is probably that sort of an argument that God wouldn't use those genes that way without using the G word. You notice that I had a little difficulty in parsing the question, and because that's typical where the metaphysics and the religion are implied and they're not stated explicitly. So evolutionists very rarely will reckon with the underlying metaphysics that they're resting on. They may not even be conscious of them. They've simply heard these arguments used over and over again, not realizing it. And this classic. I show this in a lot of the literature where rhetorical questions are used. Well, why would this be so? And it's like, well, wait a minute, where'd you get that question from? What are you talking about? And what they're talking about is God wouldn't do it that way. But they're making a question to kind of avoid making an explicit theological claim, but that's embedded in the question.
And yeah, and so Andrew's kind of saying, "LOL, you're bringing God into the picture," but I actually, like Dr. Hunter saying, no, look, the argument is made without saying the word God, but the contrast is there whether or not the word God is said. So
Yeah.
it's to bolster common ancestry, you have to like say, well, it wouldn't be such if there weren't common ancestry, right?
I think the problem is Andrew's not familiar with literature, and so he just doesn't. He's not from. When you make statements like that, you're not reckoning with evolutionary theory as it actually is. And so, if you're familiar with the literature and you've parsed it, and you've looked for all the arguments for evolution, why is evolution a fact? Why is evolution claimed to be a fact? That is the consensus position amongst evolutionists, no question about it. It's a fact beyond all reasonable doubt. Sometimes they just say it's true, beyond all reasonable doubt. So why is that? Well, evolutionists are very open about that. They've provided books and articles and so forth ever since Darwin on that question, and they give the evidence, they give the arguments, they give the evidences. They're not bashful about that. They know they have to make their case, and so they do. And they make their case with very powerful arguments. They are theological arguments. That's just black and white. And so he says you're bringing God into it. No, the evolutionists brought God into it. We're analyzing the evolutionary arguments.
And I will make one caveat to what I said, because some people will make the basically Hox genes based on naturalistic assumptions only, and they'll say, well, if it's common ancestry, like then we would expect these Hox genes, but if it's natural origins by separate ancestry, then we wouldn't expect that, right? So yeah.
Well, and again, that's a loaded question. Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't you expect it under separate ancestry? So again, this is using cleansed language to try and not be too obvious about the metaphysics. You need to ask yourself, what experiment could I perform to get to these assumptions?
And Andrew felt like we were being condescending. Andrew, I really don't. I'm sorry if it was condescending. I don't intend that. I have great respect for you, and I know that you are, very knowledgeable about science.
Well, I think maybe I said that you're not familiar with the literature. So when you are in a discussion with a theory proponent, they will use whatever argument they can to deflect what you're talking about. So you'll always it's like the Monty Python, you buy an argument, you go to this place, you pay money and say, I want to get an argument, so this guy just argues with you. No matter what you say, what's the next best retort they can come up with? So, well, you're condescending. It's like, I explained the problem. The problem is you're not familiar with the literature. Oh, that's condescending. So there's always a comeback.
Okay, Macroshaw says Evo-Devo theory predicts that you don't need many complex genes to generate complex body plans. You just change the regulatory regions, but the prediction has failed. Many animals require novel genes.
Yeah, Evo-Devo had real high expectations years ago. And they thought, oh, this is going to solve all these problems we've had with evolutionary theory, and it didn't live up to the expectations. So good point. So back to Andrew. No, I didn't mean to be condescending. I'm just simply making the point that if you understand the literature, the theology is pervasive. It's required. There's no reason to think that evolution is a fact without the theology. And why would you think that it's a fact? This is an enormous mythology that the world arose spontaneously. We don't live in a universe like that. So why would you think that?
Okay. Tyler says because evolution can be observed to happen in the lab and in the field, creationists want to change the definition of evolution to avoid this fact.
Oh, that's an ironic statement, because the changing in definition occurs by evolutionists who claim that that's evolution. So there's a long history of evolutionists saying, oh, there was pesticide resistance gained when a farmer used pesticides. There was antibiotic resistance gained when people started using antibiotics. So bacteria evolved to gain that resistance. Bugs evolved to gain that resistance out in the field. So yeah, we're observing evolution in the field. How can you deny it? It's a fact. So I'm not making this argument up. I'm parroting, I'm explaining this argument that's been used many, many, many times by leading evolutionists, professors at tier 1 research institutions and universities and so forth. This is a very common argument. You have bacteria and insects gaining resistance, therefore evolution is a fact. End of story, done. So that's an equivocation on the word evolution. That's changing the definition of evolution. Gaining resistance to bacteria, to antibiotics, is not molecules to man. That does not have anything to do with creating new bioplans, new fish evolving into amphibians, into reptiles and birds and mammals. So that now, if you look at the history of this claim, by the way, and there is a history to this claim, it didn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of, and Darwin used this, the fixity of species claim, that if God created the world, it is completely static. So the creationist model is a static world. So there is no change to any species. They never change. They are kind of like perfect, divine creation. So there'd be no need for them to change. So they're static. So any change to any species, and that includes, one mutation to one gene, or certainly, the gaining of resistance to antibiotics, any change like that, ipso facto, creationism must be false. Therefore, evolution must be true. Therefore, evolution is a fact. So this comment is a good example of this tradition, the fixity of species and the assumption of a static world under the creationist model. God, if God did it, it must be static. Therefore, come on, we've observed evolution. Well, who are you're not acknowledging the facts. No, that's not evidence for evolution. The word evolution doesn't mean resistant to antibiotics. It means all of the species arising naturalistically, and beyond that, the entire world.
Okay, well, I have one final question that I'll put up, but I want to see, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share overall about what we've been talking about?
No, I think it's been a good set of questions. Appreciate everyone. I guess I'll just say back to Andrew, I really thank you for your participation. And it is very subtle. There's no question. The deception is very subtle. And I don't mean to be condescending to anybody. I just have to say it. The truth that I have to reflect the literature and let people know what the literature actually states. And so, the literature is full of this. So when someone says, well, there's no theology here, it's like, well, of course there is. It's all over the literature. Okay, let's see the final question.
Thank you. Well, this was really great. I love this. And I do appreciate those who participate on both sides, those who are, whatever your perspective is. I'm glad that you're sharing it here and we can have these discussions. So Makrashad says, do you think Darwinism will finally collapse? Will we have another Dover trial?
That's an interesting question. And I have pondered that a little bit now and then. This is a different thing. Like if you look at Thomas Kuhn and his history of science, and he looks at all these different theories that have come and gone through their paradigm shifts. Most, if not all of those, don't have big metaphysical implications. So if they probably had some, but they weren't huge. And this one is huge, right? So evolution is different because it has these metaphysical implications and metaphysical drivers, metaphysical motivations, theological drivers, motivations. So it's harder for me to imagine this theory going away or collapsing because it's driven by a theological mandate that people aren't going to give up easily. But then what do I know? So it's very hard to predict the theory. My predictions aren't usually correct too much. I'm not a great predictor of the future. So that's a really hard question, but it's just really hard to imagine because the theology is so powerful.
And I kind of didn't want to put this one up about the Dover trial because it's like, it's as if that trial decided what science is about. Like one federal judge in America gets to decide what's true or like what science is. It's really weird. It's a bizarre thing that people bring up the Dover trial so much.
Yeah, that was Judge Jones in Pennsylvania, and Judge Jones was a Lutheran, and he said, after that trial, he got a lot of interviews. Right. And they asked him, how did it go? And how did you, what background did you bring to the trial? And what did you learn? And what was the whole experience of being kind of a non-technical, non-life scientist going through that and arriving at the correct judgment? And he said, well, I did prepare for this. I watched Inherit the Wind, the movie Inherit the Wind, as a preparation. Exactly. That is the most telling statement. And he said, I had seen it when I was, in college, but it had been a while. So I, watched it again. Inherit the Wind is basically Whig history. It's a false retelling of, Inherit the Wind is a script, is a play written about the monkey trial in 1925. And it contorts, it twists that whole 1925 story in Dayton, Tennessee, to be in line. It makes it puts it in the framework of the warfare thesis. And the warfare thesis is there's this conflict between religion and science is uncovering new truths, and religion is on the defensive, reacting as, I have to give up this position, I have to give up that position. And the religious theories are non-intellectual, anti-intellectual, and science is just neutral and just uncovering these truths. And so that's what happened in the 1925 Dover trial, 1925 Dayton trial. And that's and it paints William Jennings Bryan as a bigot and as a glutton, anti-intellectual, and the other guys as good guys. And the people of the town are all are all fundamentalists, literalists, and this is all contrived. And there's this mob, this angry mob that was wanting to kill the teacher that taught that class, and he was thrown in jail. I mean, this is all fictional. None of this happened. Like it was all made up story about the actual trial. So, but yet, I when I was school, we watched that. That was part of our social studies unit or English unit at some level, and this has gotten endless traction. It's been shown over and over and over again. The movies, the plays. It's been staged internationally. It's assumed to be a cogent retelling, a truthful retelling we need to understand. It reflects the state of creationism and how bad creationism is, and how we need to have a better understanding of this. So it's basically propaganda. You couldn't have a better propaganda film for evolutionary theory. And I once did a debate against an evolution professor. It was at a theater, and the debate was staged on a Sunday afternoon following the staging of Inherit the Wind. So the audience had seen Inherit the Wind, and then me and this evolution professor went into a debate. So I was kind of at a disadvantage, right? I won the debate, but it was kind of tough, because the audience had just seen Inherit the Wind. Really funny juxtaposition. So it's basically propaganda. And so here you have this federal judge with a great education, theoretically, openly admitting that he believed that Inherit the Wind was a cogent and important thing to be up to speed on in order to, deal with this Dover trial. Like, that was his preparation. He admitted that in the media, revealing an incredible anti-intellectual, problem on his side. So I've written about this a fair amount. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
sad.
And
Yeah.
Wes says the monkey trial never got into evidence for or against evolution. The evidence they had is now known to be fraudulent, ironically.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although there was in that famous showdown, the lawyer did use arguments about the Bible and how God wouldn't have done it this way against William Jennings Bryan. So that did come up, where the kind of religious arguments for evolution made their way into that trial.
Happy New Year to you too, BS Lewis. Thank you for your support of this channel, and thank you to everyone. Happy New Year to everyone, and we hope you enjoyed our New Year's evolution bash. And so take care. Do you have any final words, Dr. Hunter?
Happy New Year. Thank you very much, Rebekah. I appreciate it.
Take care.